Open your Bibles to Psalms 105, verse 16. Now, we're trying something new. We have a digital chalkboard. So, make sure you keep your eyes on screens back there. And when I'm writing, you just could go to the chalkboard and back to me. Just stay closely tuned to what I'm doing. Psalms. (105) is where we're going to start. Start with verse 16 and work our way through verse 22. Okay, you got that? Verse 16, well, actually, this whole chapter is really how God takes care of his people. And it refers to Abraham, and the covenant that was made to Abraham and then confirmed with Isaac and Jacob, and then we get up to Joseph's time period. And it reads in verse 16, "Moreover, he called for a famine upon the land. He brake the whole staff of bread. He sent a man before them, Joseph, was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron, or his soul came into iron, until the time that his word came, the word of the Lord tried him." I preached a message on that somewhere in the archives. "The king sent and loosed him, even the ruler of the people, and let him go free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his substance," or literally possessions, "to bind his princes at his pleasure, and teach his senators wisdom." Now, think about it. Everybody preaches, well, God prepared Joseph and sent him on ahead before the famine hit. And that's the reason Joseph was sent to Egypt, even though he was sold for a servant. And he spent some hard time in prison because he was lied upon by an evil woman. And he would not be disfaithful or unfaithful to his master. So he's thrown in prison for it. Spent probably around no more than 13 years, but somewhere up to 13 years in prison. Probably watching people come and go, and he's still in prison. Probably watching people die in prison, and he was still in prison. Probably wondering what in the heck was going on. We don't know. Did he still keep dreaming dreams? Did somehow God communicate it to him while he was in prison? Or those were silent years? Or were those silent years in prison? No communication from God. But nevertheless, when he did interpret dreams to some of the kings or pharaoh's servants, guess what? Either he had the wisdom, or God communicated him through some source, some way, maybe in more dreams of his own, that would give the insight how to interpret the dreams of other prisoners, that eventually that information made its way back to Pharaoh. We'll never know completely what happened, but nevertheless, I was never really satisfied with all the preaching and reading that I've heard about this man Joseph? Because I've had questions. Why would God have to prepare Joseph to go before his family? Because when the famine hit, his family came in looking for food, because the only place that had food was in Egypt, because of Joseph's administration, how to save during the plenty years and how to be a distributor in the famine years, because they had the necessary food that was required to survive in those days. Why would God have to even worry about that? Could he just not avoid the famine completely? God being God could have said no famine. Now he forewarned even Abraham of a time that was coming that Jacob, Joseph, and their offsprings would experience in Egypt. But the thing is, why didn't God just avoid all that? Choose another object lesson. Choose another way to communicate and build these people's faith and see if they would trust in him. Why use a famine? Why send Joseph ahead if that was the only reason? Because the way you hear it preach is, well, the reason why is because Joseph had to go beforehand, so the nation of Israel, which was only about 70 plus people, would not be distinguished, would not be forever lost in history and died out, or whatever the reason. Really? Really? See, I'm a firm believer that even though that was a very important part of Joseph's life, because God decided that there was going to be a famine. In fact, here in these verses it says, moreover, he called for a famine. Who called for a famine? God called for a famine upon the land. He brake the whole staff of bread. So it's God's doing. So God decided to choose this method for some reason. Because if there was not going to be such a horrible famine, Jacob would never left. Maybe even Joseph. Future would have been different. Maybe he would have dreamt dreams. Maybe he would not be so disliked by his brethren, his brothers. Who knows? We'll never know all the facts behind the story and the reasons why. We have a glimpse of what happened. And one of the reasons why, because he would prepare the way for Israel and the 70 plus people that would arrive eventually, and they would survive and they would flourish and they would populate themselves into the millions by some calculations. So was that the whole purpose of Joseph going to Egypt? Or did God have something bigger in mind? Yes, he fulfilled that purpose, and that's the purpose, I believe, was a part of Joseph's reason for being in Egypt, that God placed him there for not just that reason, but for multiple reasons. So, bottom line is, Joseph was there, A, because during the famine, Israel would be able to survive, and they would settle, by the way, in the most plushest land, the most producing part of the land, the Delta Nile area, which is in Lower Egypt, which now is Northern Egypt. But I don't really believe that's okay. Part A, Israel, the nation, would survive. The nation, when I say nation, that's 70 plus people, because of Joseph's connections, because Pharaoh loved Joseph like his own son, and he gave him power to rule. Only in the throne was Pharaoh more powerful. But everything else, he said, Joseph, you run it all. You minister all this, and we're going to find out that's exactly what he did. But the thing is, I don't believe, part A, fulfilled, done, accomplished. What about the rest of Joseph's life? What happened? Are those silent years, or can we get a glimpse into his life? Maybe not through the biblical sources, but maybe through other sources. secular history when we connect Imhotep to Joseph. So I believe there's multiple reasons why Joseph was in Egypt for the purposes God had in mind. So, what are those purposes? Let me continue where I left off. It is during Zozer's. Now, those of you who want to look into Zozer's life, because we'll spend some time in his period, he was the king or pharaoh that released Joseph from prison. Now, you're going to find it spelled Z-O-S-E-R. He's another pharaoh that had a multiple amount of names. You're going to also be known as Neter or Neter, Ket. There's another way of Zesira, and also Tosothros. These are all different names. And there might be actually more than that, but 1, 2, 3, 4 different names. Zozer, Neterket, Sesera, and Tosotros. Now, these are, but we're going to concentrate on this name right here, Zozer. There's another way of spelling it also, which I'll get to in the future. But just remember Zozer. That's the pharaoh that released Joseph from prison and made him ruler of all the nation of Egypt. And it is during Zozer's reign that we see the sudden, explosive birth of another age, by the way. You come back to me. The Pyramid Age. The Pyramid Age. In the riddle of the pyramids, here's a statement from that book. The most astonishing feature of this development was the lack of any preparatory phase. It seems that within one generation, Egypt had stepped from a semi-tribal state into a highly organized society, capable of astounding communal effort. 3 essential conditions were required to launch Egypt into the age of pyramid building. 1, a technological mastermind was needed to design such structures. This was supplied by Egypt's first counselor, or Vizier, a sage named Imhotep. Now, Imhotep, let me use a different color. We'll write his name in red. Imhotep. Imhotep. By the way, which will be proven out, he was none other than Joseph. So a technological mastermind was needed to design such structures. And of course, this was supplied by Egypt's first chancellor, Vizier, a sage named Imhotep. A statue once stood in the ceremonial court of the Step Pyramid. And I'll have plenty to say about the Step Pyramid in the future. The statue once stood in the ceremonial court of the step pyramid. Although it has long since vanished, its remaining pedestals bears his name. The citation says, Counselor of the king of Lower Egypt, first after the king of Upper Egypt, a minister of the great palace, a nobleman, a high priest of Heliopolis, a builder, a sculptor, and maker of vases in chief. Vases in chief. 2. A reliable and strong workforce was necessary. These massive social projects unified the populace into a common goal, which not only helped to make them dependent upon the king, but thereby created a strong central government. 3. The third and most important prerequisite to build these mammoth structures was for the royalty to become wealthy enough to supply such a large labor force. And we'll look onto all these claims. Historians have failed to even ask such questions, much less devise the necessary answers. How these requirements were accomplished proves to be one of the more shocking revelations of ancient history. For it is here that our new historical model gets so powerful that the word proof enters our vocabulary. As traditionalists agree, the abrupt dawning of the pyramidal age definitely belongs to Dynasty 3. Dynasty 3. Let me just write it right here in red. Dynasty 3. This is where the explosion happened, friends, in Dynasty 3. But during King Zoser's reign, an unexpected explosion of another nature also takes place. It is here that we discover the convergence of numerous crucial and pivotal events in history, and here is where we find one man fulfilling, either directly or indirectly, all three of those prerequisites. The man's name was Imhotep. He was the mastermind and architect which launched the Pyramid Age. Now, you're saying all pyramids? Some are going to say, well, I differ when it comes to the Great Pyramid. I'm convinced Enoch built it. Are you? Can you give me the proof? Can you even give me enough circumstantial evidence that Enoch, some believe it was Job, but nevertheless, can you, either one of those, can you give me enough evidence that he built the Great Pyramid? Now, I'm not saying right now if he did or didn't, but the one thing I will say, he received enough information to definitely design it or leave some type of designs behind if he had any connection to the Great Pyramid. Because when you analyze, including everyone that's written about and taught on the Great Pyramid, their proof on who built it is shallow. It really is. They go into the super spiritual happenings of the watchers coming down, and before they backslid and start chasing the ladies, They were helping Enoch build it because of the fine precision cutting and so forth, and not to mention the weight of these, some stones up to 200 tons. So it had to be some type of angelic cooperation that was taking place for any man, Enoch or Job or whoever, to build such a monstrosity, and with such specifications that go along with it. And that pyramid really is the Grand Pyramid, because no other pyramid's like it, as far as what it's communicating and the structure and the design. But there's only one problem with all that. And this is what happens when you're not given all the information. About halfway, just a little above halfway maybe, of the pyramid. Let's see if I could clear some of this out, and let me just write. Let me erase some of this and draw a pyramid for you. Hopefully you got all those names down. About halfway, say right there, something happens from this point. Actually, the Great Pyramid doesn't really have a point. It's missing its capstone. So we'll just remove that. Oh, I just took the whole thing out. Still learning how to use this. Here, it doesn't have a point now. From this point to that point, there's definitely something that happens with the construction. From about the halfway point from the bottom, you see something that happens to this kind of this construction. From here to here, there's no doubt about the quality of the construction. But from here to here, the standards change. The standard changed. What happened? You can tell in all this area that the construction is totally different from all this area. Totally different. What happened? Now, my drawing looks pathetic, but I'm just trying to make a point. What happened to the construction? Nobody wants to talk about the quality of construction and how it changed about halfway up. And the latter part of the top portion of, from the middle to the top, is totally different quality of kind of construction that took place. If you believe the Watchers built it, did they get lazy? Did Enoch get lazy? They just wanted to finish the job. Come back to me. And get it over with. Or did Enoch or Watchers actually build it? Was there any angelic cooperation at all? I have no doubts about it. There is a timeline in the Great Pyramid and a message. Many messages, actually. And I believe it was a time capsule. And I believe whoever did build it understood its purpose. And we're just now, in the last 100 to 150 years, coming to know what that purpose is. I'm not saying Enoch built it or not built it. But I'm saying something happened. You don't believe me? Check it out. Something happened to the quality of construction about halfway through the project. And if angelics were involved, why would that happen? You ever question that? If you already known about it? You ever question why the quality of construction would change? Well, maybe they already had their eyes on the ladies and their standards fell below what was required to finish the job, like how they started it. You can come up with all those silly speculations. Well, I try to put flesh and blood into stories. See, I always question, God had enough of angelic interference with mankind prior to the flood. And of course, because of its interference, it created all kinds of problems, including giants that they're devouring everything in sight, and wickedness and all kinds of things that were going on, where God had to destroy the world because there was no hope for it to return back to following Him as the only true triune God. Instead of all these other false gods that were being established and worshipped. Was there good angels that helped Enoch prior to the flood? And there was bad angels causing all the problems before the flood? All this angelic interference? Now I know what many believe, that the angels were created to serve us. Some believe that. So they were their assistants. They were the assistants of Enoch to build this great pyramid, according to their speculations. Well, that might be true, and it might not be true. It's just very little proof that he did build it. There's very little proof. And of course they want to use water lines and flood lines prior to the flood as evidence that it went through the flood. There's only one problem with that theory too, and it breaks down that it was you built it too close to the Nile River. To base your theory on that fact alone. Because it's been proven out many times, if you look at all the evidence, that the Nile flood zone and patterns not only reached the Great Pyramid, but beyond the Great Pyramid at certain periods of history, if you look at the geological evidence. So what was going on? Who do you believe? Can we come any closer to trying to figure this out? We'll see. Like I said, I'm not saying he did build it. I'm not saying he didn't build it. I'm just saying there's too many unanswered questions to come to a definite conclusion. Yes, he did build with all certainty. Well, if that's your conclusion, then you don't need that much evidence to believe just about anything, I guess. That's not the way I think. But let's continue, because I don't want to get sidetracked on that the rest of this evening. The man's name was Imhotep. He was a mastermind and architect that launched the Pyramid Age. Imhotep was the one processing the architectural genius to construct such revolutionary edifices. He was the man which gave the king the needed information to organize and support a large workforce to accomplish this daunting task. 3. Imhotep was also the man that supplied the royal state with the wealth to undertake the world's most grandiose civil project. How Imhotep accomplished all this we will divulge later, but now let us look closer at this man's identity. Who was Egypt's most loved counselor? Annals of Egypt's history make no mention, nor do the tombs indicate any vizier, prime minister, prior to the great Imhotep. So before Imhotep, before Dynasty 3, there was no counselor, there was no vizier, there was none of that stuff, titles, positions in Egyptian government. Scholars generally accept him as the first of Egypt's counselors. In ancient times, a person who was made king because he was the most capable leader. Anyone more capable would themselves become a rival to the throne. Yet a foreigner comes to Egypt, having much greater capabilities than the king. Fortunately, this man was not a warrior, but he had an unbelievable wisdom and charisma. This is speaking about Imhotep, not Joseph, Imhotep. One of the same. Egyptian legends does not supply the story of how Imhotep became Egypt's first prime minister. But he was so beloved by the people that he was to become not just a god, but according to historians, the only known real person to achieve a position of deity among Egypt's large pantheon. Now, Imhotep didn't seek that, neither did Joseph. As time went on, unfortunately, people look back and say, wow, let's worship as God. Now, there was a time period that didn't happen. But as dynasties look back upon dynasties, and if the dynasty goes further back, and say like you're in the 12th to 13th dynasty, you start placing these people that lived in positions, even as deities, in your system of history and how it's recorded and how important those people were to you. Even though historians separate them by 1,000 years, unfortunately, there existed another man who was intensely loved by the people. The Hebrew book of Jasher says in Jasher 49:42, "And all the inhabitants of Egypt and Pharaoh's servant and his princes loved Joseph exceedingly, for this thing was from the Lord to Joseph." Obviously, it's no strange coincidence that the Egyptians loved two men through Egypt's long history, but further comparisons between these two men builds a strange model. Among Egypt's long list of viziers, Joseph's name cannot be recognized, while Imhotep's name comes first. Let us attempt to see if Joseph can not only be classified as a vizier, but if he qualifies as Egypt's original prime minister. Joseph explains to the king in Genesis 41:33. "Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man wise and discreet, and set him over the land of Egypt." What a novel idea, to set a man to manage the land of Egypt. That is what a vizier's duty is. This means that no vizier already had this job. Later, this idea is confirmed. In Genesis 41, verses 39 through 41, it reads, "And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God has showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according to thy word shall all the people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt." Obviously, Joseph had been appointed vizier. But wait, the whole story gives the impression that this position was a new idea to the Pharaoh, an idea suggested by Joseph. So if there was a position already, and someone occupying the position, he would have to have been fired. But the impression that's given by the scriptures is there was no one in that position to start with. So it'd be a new position, a new title. And this is why many historians say the beginning of the third dynasty is when Egypt's government became very organized. If a grand vizier was already in place, Joseph would have no need to suggest that the king appoint one. There could not have already existed a vizier whom Joseph replaced. It clearly was a new position. In essence, this means that Joseph was the original vizier. Of course, this is impossible because, according to traditional historians, Imhotep already originated the job 1,000 years before Joseph was born. That 1,000-year gap again. Imhotep was a chief advisor to Zoser in both religious and practical matters. The chief advisor in religious and practical matters. He controlled the judiciary court systems, the treasury, the war department, and agricultural department. Well, perhaps Joseph was the original vizier among the latter Hyksos dynasties, which would place that between dynasty 13 and 16, much later. Unfortunately for this idea, the Hyksos were well acquainted with the Egyptian custom of viziers because they had inhabited Egypt prior to taking the throne. Here we arrive at a dead end because obviously both men cannot be the original vizier. These texts support the concept that Joseph was the first of the grand viziers. Who was Imhotep? He was not a king, but he was, according to history, a scientist, a diplomat, a poet, an architect, and keeper of sacred vessels. He was also an administrator and medical doctor. Under his direction at Saqqara, and we'll take an in-depth look at Saqqara in future teachings. Under his direction at Saqqara, handsome stone buildings and sophisticated construction of many types were erected in Egypt. Imhotep, Grand Vizier of the second pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, was one of the very few in Egypt well-filled pantheon who was promoted from mortal to deity. Egyptologists of the last century, of course, from mortal to deity didn't happen until much later in later dynasties. Dynasties that would put Imhotep in that position way after the Exodus, by the way. Egyptologists of the last century were skeptical about Imhotep's actual existence. At that time, the only information they had about him was found in accounts written 2.5 millennia after his presumed lifetime. However, in 1926, archaeologists established that Imhotep was a real living person, not just a legend. A statue of the pharaoh Zoser was dug from the sand around Saqqara. On the base of it were Imhotep's name and his titles. Therefore, Egyptologists now feel justified in saying that Imhotep was responsible for constructing the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first of Egypt's pyramids. Was it the first? We'll see. Ancient tradition credits Imhotep as the wisest man in Egypt's history. I'll read that again to you slowly. Ancient tradition credits Imhotep as the wisest man in Egypt's history. Strangely, Joseph, son of Jacob, was also credited in Hebrew writings as Egypt's wise one. In Genesis 41:39, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "Forasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is none so discreet and wise as you are." In Genesis 41:39. These two men had several commonalities. 1, both were greatly loved. 2, both were Egyptian viziers. 3, both were not native Egyptians. That's right, Imhotep was not an Egyptian. 4, both were original viziers. No viziers prior to that. 5, both were renowned sages for their wisdom. Now I'll begin next time looking at more commonalities between these two men, which are not two men. They're one and the same. Imhotep was Joseph, or Joseph was Imhotep. In fact, Joseph's name, you've seen all these dynasties. Oh, I read a few of them to you. But take, for instance, Zoser, we looked at tonight. I gave you 4 different names, and there's more for Zoser. You ever come across someone, usually in Latin America, they'll have not just the first name and last name, they'll have a first name, then they'll have 2 or 3 names after the first name, and then their last name. I remember my grandmother. Her name was Avelina Costa de Conceição. 4 names. Name, her first name, her marriage name, and then where she came from name. I mean, it's nothing new in having multiple names for one person, especially in Egypt's history. There's some that have 6, 7, 8 names for one person. We know, and we will read in the scriptures what the Bible says his name was changed to. And that was just one of the many names he probably had, including Imhotep. And we'll look at maybe even Pathotep and other names. These 2 men were not 2 separate men living in 2 different times. They were the same man. Imhotep was Joseph and Joseph was Imhotep. Because of the gap, it seems like they lived during separate times. They didn't. You remove the gap, which I showed you already why we should remove it. Then you line this up perfectly that both these men were one and the same. Now, when I continue, we're going to go on with the fame of Imhotep and more of his accomplishments. And we will get to some more of these pyramid building subjects and topics. Now, are you interested? God sent a man before them, Joseph. Why? Yes, so Jacob's family could survive during a horrible famine that God made sure it happened. But was that the only reason? Now, it's the reason why the scriptures, the reason that the scriptures gives us, and it's a very important reason. It's the reason number 1. But what other reasons? What other reasons was Joseph down there in Egypt? God sent a man, God prepared a man, God accomplished what he wanted to accomplish through that man, and he left some important things that we need to look at, that God wanted our attention in these latter days. Are you interested? If you are, I want to hear you play a song.